Hello, everyone. Thank you all. I'm glad to see we've got 10 people here already, and some folks we know joining us for the first ever episode of DevRelish. Oh, Rachel is here. Great to see you, Rachel. Um, so I'm let's just get to it. What's this show about? Since this is the first ever time we're doing this, I want to talk a little bit about what can you expect from this show from Erin and I, and then a little bit about why we're talking about DevRel, and all that. So anyway, we'll get to it. So first of all, Erin,
Yeah.
let's talk about why we came up with DevRel-ish. Why DevRel-ish, not
Well,
just
it
Dev.
all started back when we had a fond love of sandwiches, pickle. Just kidding. But first off, thank you so much. I see a lot of familiar faces in the comments. So it's very exciting to see here. Love the people here. Love working, kind of collaborating with you, Brian. It wasn't the first time. I've been very excited about this. But both of us realize it's kind of a long, arduous, different, not linear journey into the world of DevRel that involved a lot of general-ish to get there. And it's usually your day-to-day in DevRel adjacent, DevRel related. Doesn't really have a one-size-fits-all agenda, much like a plethora of pickles. I don't know where we're going to go with this analogy, but
So yeah, I agree with that. So we'll get a little bit to our backgrounds in DevRel, but I've had a long journey in DevRel, and not all my titles were DevRel, and I've seen a lot of companies who do DevRel who have lots of people who are like community managers or I had content manager and things like that. The titles were not DevRel, but the roles actually were DevRel-ish. They were DevRel adjacent, I like to call them. And I've been always saying DevRel-ish because it describes my career, and that was for where I came up with the name, and and we kind of went with the relish. Um, we had fun with the relish part of it. So so let's actually talk in that sense, a little bit about our backgrounds and why we're talking about DevRel, what we do in DevRel. So just a little bit about me for those of you. I know a bunch of you are in the audience, but my background in DevRel, I started in a DevRel-ish, was a community manager role, but at Adobe, and that was 12 years ago. DevRel was kind of something relatively new. Rachel who's watching, was there. She and I worked together at Adobe at the time. So anyway, that was kind of my start, but I got to it. I kind of came to it because I was already doing running conferences and local user groups and writing articles, and it just kind of seemed like that was what I love to do. And well, this is an opportunity to maybe make a career out of that. And I've wound through a number of jobs. Only a couple of them actually were developer advocate. All the others had a variety of titles that were not necessarily developer advocate or currently I'm developer experience engineer, whatever, these are, we kind of throw lots of fancy titles at DevRel roles, but I've had a bunch of them, very few being just developer advocate. What about you?
Yeah, so I dropped it in the chat. My direction into the community DevRel space literally was on accident. I joke about this a lot. I've told it in a few conferences. My career trajectory literally was I was a product manager. This was 2020. I was at an open source e-commerce platform and was getting called in. It was like, hey, remember that beta testing community that you were working on? And I was like, yeah, you're doing a really great job of that. And I was like, cool, awesome job, boss. And I was like, and he's like, I have great news for you. We need to hire a community person. And I was like, awesome. That sounds great. Let me know how it goes when you're hiring that community person, because I don't know what to do with a community. I'm just running this beta testing group. And they're like, yeah, I think you'd be a great person for our head of community. And I was like, cool, I guess. And no, I did not get a pay raise or any updates, but I was the head of community. And promptly after that, I Googled what does a community person do in an open source e-commerce platform, and Googled and then found myself into this world. So needless to say, I didn't even know it was a real job, my first job into this space, and very quickly fell into the space, this role, the exciting world of it. Currently now I am a senior developer community advocate at Label Studio, which is a open source machine learning and data labeling platform. So I get to work in a very cool, exciting tech stack. I really enjoy it. A lot of my background is very non-linear. Originally started my career in journalism, product. I wanted to be a political reporter, and that was actually my first internship, was a court reporter. So, ish. We're here now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, my degree was in history that led me here. So
Upcoming on DevRel-ish, when do we talk about where's the politics and history episode?
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think, it is kind of a funny career in that sense. Like I think a lot of people end up in it like not even realizing this could be a job, right? We're just like it's kind of like you know trying to explain what we do to people who don't know about DevRel can be often difficult. Like I tell people who like are not in the field, I'm like, I'm basically paid to write about and speak about and and whatever like others like about our product to developers who who say they don't like marketing, but I'm like marketing to them in many
Technically still,
ways.
yeah, you're like, it's this weird, but like not in a gross way. Like and I say that with love. I have actually been a product marketing person, so I've worn that hat too. And, I think one of the things that when you're in these roles, I always joke, 2 years ago, my parents used to say that I spammed the internet. We've got them to not say that I don't spam the internet anymore. And more recently, a year ago, they used to say I talk to strangers online for a living, is what my parents said I did. But we've got now it's I
That's
teach
true.
people about. I mean, that's very true. And I was like, cool. So we've got from spamming the internet. Now my parents think I talk to strangers online and somehow get paid for it. And now they have moved into Erin teaches things online, but not like an MLM.
Yeah.
So
Well, I also think I wanted to bring up like it's interesting. Your career brought you also to a company where you were in developer relations, talking to developer relations professionals, which is must have been even especially different.
meta.
Like, yeah,
It's
yeah, very meta.
yeah, it's very, and looking back, it's like I it only made me double down on the DevRel-ish. Like I worked for a community tooling company, and it made me double down on the DevRel-ish, because it would be like, okay, and that's the hard part, right? Like, and I think I'd often talk about like there's this spectrum of web development, even, right? Like you could have a card.co site or a Wix site, which is a very out of the box plug and play. You're not going to get a lot of customization, and you're pretty sandboxed in what you can do. Or you can have like a completely built from scratch, custom code, self-hosted solution. And those are two very different options. And there's not one option that's better than the other. It's really depending on your circumstances and what you need and the tooling you're working with and the organization and the goals that you're trying to achieve, which, much like communities and companies and developers, like that's also another thing. Like I'm now working, like the tech stack I work with is Python machine learning and data scientist, which is a very different tech stack I was working with a year ago, even.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
right. And you brought up the
gotta
issue
learn.
of like where does it even fit in the organization? I'd be curious, like if folks put in the comment, like where if you're in DevRel, do you sit in the organization? Because like I've been at a bunch of companies, and we were always at different parts of the like. Right now, we report to the PMM team. So DevRel is kind of like a sub of the PMM team. But I've been like the office of the CTO was a prior one. We were in sometimes in engineering, sometimes in reporting into like marketing directly. I mean, it's like it really seems to be. And this is why I think the experience of being a DevRel kind of can adjust to basically different organizations. Is not only just does the scope of the job change, but also like even just the reporting structure changes. Like, I can tell you for certain that your job tends to be different as a DevRel person if you're in marketing, versus if you're reporting into engineering. Um, so that even that aspect can really change what it means to be a DevRel.
I'm loving all these different posts that are
Yeah.
coming in. Like Rachel's even putting like, currently I live in customer support, and I've been in roles where community and DevRel was customer support. You just didn't hire customer support, and that was part of your job extension. When I was on this most recent job search, that was something very intentionally. Internal and external DevRel, I've heard about that happening before, and that
Yeah.
like my brain would be like exploding. It's really interesting. Like, and one of the things I'm really enjoying right now is like we're an open source product. So like I don't largely like, it's not that I don't work with our enterprise users, but like my day to day largely is spent with our open source audience and our open source users. Like, it doesn't mean I don't like, my initiatives are largely around what benefits the open source community. But it doesn't mean that I don't think about our enterprise users, but that's not my primary goal. Like, my primary targets, objectives, initiatives, and what my success metrics are determined on those open source community, which means that changes the scope of work very differently. Like, they have different processes for enterprise users, and that's okay. But it also, like, with open source, your field of work can also do this and expand very quickly. I remember at my old job, I was working a lot with like, what integration do we build next? And I think very specifically about, there is one instance, like we were working a lot, like different tools you could measure community activity in. And someone every week would ask me, when are you going to integrate with Google Docs? And I was like what? Like, I have no idea why. This makes no sense. But because we were a community driven organization, like each week he had like the lobbying campaign for when is Google Docs coming out? When is this integration coming out? Which is cool, but you definitely have to kind of go back to, what does that mean for the larger organization?
Yep. Yeah. And I saw some people, like lots of people talking about the different groups that they report into. And you mentioned even having like an internal and external. I've even seen like when I joined Launch Darkly, we had two teams. I was technically the beginning of the developer experience team, which was, again, it was DevRel-ish, and then we had a DevRel team, and they literally had distinguished between uh, DevRel for external, like basically thought leadership type DevRel versus DevRel that was more like about actually like digging into the code and showing how to use the product and stuff like that. And so those teams are now merged, but I've seen other companies where like you have a team that's DevRel that reports into engineering, and then you have a team that's DevRel that reports into PMM or marketing, or like even other places like folks I know at AWS, when I've interviewed there and talked to other people who work there, and they have like multiple DevRel teams that report into, sometimes like they have a larger DevRel team and they have smaller DevRel individuals who will report directly into the product that they're representing. So yeah, I think it makes for, it's one of the things about the role of DevRel. Like I can say, having been an engineer at multiple companies, it was always, the experience was often similar. Like the companies were different, but the job was not that different. And DevRel, like really every company you go to, it can be a completely different type of job. So yeah.
And
Oh,
just want to call out, sorry, I was going to say, I want to do one last thing before we switch topics. I know we're kind of,
yeah.
but one more thing. I don't have a developer background. I've never been a developer. And so very, very clear. And I want to like make that explicitly clear is you do not have to be a developer to be in DevRel. However, I will give the caveat of one of my pet peeves and the thing that I'm starting as I start to move more and senior in my career is I do strongly believe you should have an understanding of the tech stack that you're working with and feel confident speaking and at least reading documentation or writing documentation, because being able to troubleshoot the tech stack that you are working with is a really great way to gain confidence in your organization. I don't remember who gave me this advice, but it was a mentor. I believe it was actually Maddie Stratton that actually gave this to me, I believe. I hope I'm quoting this right. If you gave this advice to me, thanks. And I do use it, but it was like kind of the minute that someone else in an organization assigns you your job, you're out as a DevRel. And it's like, and one reason that that's kind of cost people their role is because if you're asking 100 questions about the tech stack, you don't have the confidence and you will be kind of written off as just another influencer or a creator or someone who's just playing around while the engineers do the quote unquote real work. So being familiar with the tech stack and being able to decipher a tech stack is really important. And so, yes, you can come into DevRel without an engineering background, but that doesn't mean you can't be non-technical.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I would agree with you. I think, it's changed a lot in the 12 years I've been doing this. Back 12 years ago, you had to come in as like a known entity, and which is why I kind of snuck in through like being a community manager, because like there wasn't a lot of DevRel roles, and so everybody who was like DevRel was like a big big name. We already knew them from some other work they were doing. So like, and I love the fact that now that DevRel's expanded, we have all different kinds of roles and different kinds of backgrounds and experience, and it's really changed. And I think it's a much more dynamic role than it was before, and to me a much more interesting role. So okay, so real quick, we before we move on to actually what we're going to talk about today, I want to just kind of give a quick rundown, like, so because we got a lot of folks here, and I'm really excited about that. Just for kind of like let you know what we're going to do with this show going forward. Today, we're going to just kind of hit on some topics that we were interested in because this is our first show and we just wanted to kind of introduce ourselves to you. But like going forward, we do plan on we're going to talk hot topics for DevRel folks, as well as have some really great guests. And we've already got one signed up for our next show, I hope. So we'll announce that soon. And really excited about some of the names. So like, we also, some of you all in the audience are DevRel folks who we'd love to have on this show. So if you're interested, just reach out to us. But that's kind of like what we're going to do with the show going forward. But today we are just going to talk about a couple of posts that we read, and kind of the topics that they bring up. So we're going to start with this one. The DevRel influencer trend. I don't know if anybody in the audience read this one. I saw it was I know a lot of folks here are already familiar with the DevRel Slack. I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden, but DevRel Collective Slack, which that's where I caught this one. And we just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about our thoughts on this. I thought this was a little bit of a, to use your term from earlier, a spicy take, right? So, and I have mixed feelings about it, but I want to hear your thoughts first.
Ooh, my thoughts. So
Oh yeah,
I read
I put
it.
you on the spot. I'm sorry.
I know, like, oh, like he's like, let's see, spicy take. Let's put Erin right on the spot on that one. So going through this post, one of the things that first off, and I say this as someone who has actually wrangled influencers for a random freelance contract, and actually in the beauty industry, again, when you do random things to pay for graduate school, it's like and going back to my post about credibility as a developer advocate or DevRel engineer, whatever the title is. And again, I do not mean this to say that you cannot be non-technical and work in tech or in developer relations, or that you need to have a formally taught explicit background. what I mean to say is you will lose a lot of credibility with working with developers or technical individuals if you don't know the language to speak. There is a tweet or a meme or a TikTok floating around. I don't remember where it was the other day that was like, it said something along the lines of like, you know, CLI tools. It was like developer influencer equals CLI tools. Yes. And then that was the whole tweet, that it was like, you know, actual developer. Here's cool tips of how to use this and like actual help there. And you can see the difference where someone's just using a keyword and then someone's actually providing help. I don't know if you've ever read documentation that sucks and you're like, wow, I actually
never read documentation that sucks.
Yeah, I've never read documentation that sucks. All docs are wonderful. But I think the big thing to acknowledge here is that technical expertise and not just doing it for the sake of doing it, but actually knowing what you're talking about. And I think that's also comes down to DevRel. Like, again, I mentioned I joined a new company in late November, early December. Part of it was a new tech stack. I haven't been very versed in the machine learning space, but I have written SQL. I have written Python. I had data science backgrounds. I had done some other things, but was getting up to speed in other elements. It's okay for you to say, I don't know this right now. Let me get back up. It's okay for you to call in someone else, but you better be busting your butt to get up to speed. And I think that's kind of the difference that they're talking about here.
Well, yeah, and that I will say, like, that's a little bit of my worry. So for folks who didn't read the article, it kind of talks a little bit about this idea that she feels like some companies are just hiring people for their social media reach, who really are not, you know, that's kind of their primary job is, and so like it's a little more of a salesy marketing job than DevRel, and that she worries that the confusion between those people and DevRel might undervalue what an actual DevRel a person does. And I think there is some truth to that. I also worry about being like, and I'm not trying to say was her intent, but I worry about that you could take this perspective and become kind of gatekeepy, and it's like, well, I can't let somebody say with your background, kind of like, your original background, say like, okay, you can't have this DevRel role because we need, this would be that was the DevRel I came from 12 years ago, where like you had to be like the well-known expert in whatever it was you were talking about, before you could even get that role. And by the way, guess who got that role? It was, it was not a very diverse group of people, let's just say. And so I think, I'm just, I worry that sometimes if we kind of put these barriers in place, like, I think you can come into it because, you're particularly good at talking to developers on social media and have that ability to influence how, they're bring them onto, like, bring their interest into the product, and not necessarily be a deep expert in that product, or even a deeply experienced developer. But I agree with you that, like, you should evolve in that role and take on more of that, spend your time learning the product, spend your time, beefing up your ability to code and things like that. You can't just, and in the end, be like, okay, I'm just a social media influencer kind of thing.
Yeah, and I love what Black Girl Bites puts in the comment. I think we are marketers and influencers in the sense that we have a lot of influence over the product's users. I know we steer away from that saying because it undermines our skill, but we also have to say that, like, technical individuals with strong communication skills. And this is something I want to reiterate. Like, DevRel isn't just development, and DevRel isn't just communication. You don't get A or B. You have to have both skill sets. And I have actually seen and worked with folks that are, developers that didn't have the communication skills, that, weren't a great fit as a DevRel, and they didn't make it very long. I've also worked with, people who had great communication skills that didn't have the development technical expertise. And exactly what you said, Brian, so I was laid off from my job in August. I came from a very privileged position where I was working in academia part-time. I'm a professor on the side. And so I was able to take 4 or 5 months off from a full-time role and consult and freelance and teach and research and live my double life in academia. And one of the things, I actually had 4 or 5 jobs reject me because I didn't have a developer. I had never been a developer before. And they were like, unless you have developer, and that was the one thing I asked, what is the thing that I was not qualified for this job? And they were like, you have not been explicitly a developer or have a computer science background.
Yep.
And we cannot, that is like our company policy. We cannot hire it. I had one company, I begged them to let me take the tech exam and I was like, can I just take your tech exam to practice? And they gave it to me and I passed and they still would not hire me. And I was like, are you kidding me? And so be aware that that does exist. But on my end, I did have to learn because I was doing a pretty poor job. And this is something I'm working on now in this role, is I did a pretty crappy job of posting my technical content on my own site. Like I had posted it and written technical content for the company I was working for, but I didn't really update it on my own site. So lessons learned, make sure you're cross-posting that stuff on your own site.
Yeah, I have 2 quick things to say on this, and then and maybe we'll move on to the next post. But those are all excellent points. And I would say, first of all, just because you're a good developer doesn't mean you're going to be good at this job, right? So like I've actually known lots of people who were really good, excellent developers who did not do well at this. In fact, didn't like the job because I used to warn them like, hey, by the way, they're like, this isn't really a job that's all about coding. Like if you really love to sit and code all the time, this probably isn't the job for you. I'm like, I'm like, I spend a lot of my time not actually coding stuff. And so, and I think most folks that I've talked to, it's very similar. But then the second point is that you can also, in that windy path of DevRelish, find yourself outside, on the outside, kind of having to prove yourself all over again. Like when I had taken a role, I kind of gotten promoted for a while, and I was like a director level role. And it was, in title wise, especially, it was more of a management role. And then I had to I wanted to get back to DevRel. I kind of want to take a step back into like actual DevRel stuff. And the way I kept interviewing, and people were like, you've been a manager. I'd only been doing this role for like a year. And they're like, well, you're a manager. You're not really like a DevRel. Can you actually code anymore? It's like, it's like I was a developer for 20 some odd years. Come on. Like, right. I still code even. It was hard to even prove that to them that I did that. So I sat there and like the way I got my next role was I started posting on Dev2 and on my blog like every single week for, I think it was like 40 weeks that I went on. Every single week I posted something without fail, even when I was on vacation, because I'm like, this is gonna, like, I need to just kind of beef up my resume in terms of like, what have I done lately? Like, okay, so yeah, I'm a manager at my job, but I'm also doing all this stuff. So, um, so I was looking at Cody's talk. He's the guy who does a conference talk and then disappears for an hour or two to recharge his soul. Yeah, I hear that. So it's better than being the ones, like I used to go to a lot of conferences where there was people who just, the DevRel folks who showed up for the talk and then left. And I'm not a fan of that, to be honest. It's like, you got to be there. You got to be there, part of it. Speaking of conferences.
Participate. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of conferences, so we're going to talk real quick. Our last topic for the day. It's actually about a post that I wrote that like shocked me that it kind of caught on. Like I've gotten so many comments about this post, and it showed up all over the place. Yeah. Yes, Cody, I'm self-plugging myself. But we were talking about topics, and this was one that like seemed to be a very strong, had a lot of impact on people like in the DevRel community who came back and said like, yes, I've seen the same thing. Because I mean, one thing's about DevRel folks that, first of all, a lot of us, we're not just speaking at events. A lot of us are actually actively running events too. So so I think that, including myself, I've run events for, I guess, like 15 years now. in various capacities, both online and in person, and big company events and small, community conferences and stuff like that. Um, so as DevRel folks, we're like DevRel-ish folks. We are involved in events all the time. Like events are a big part of our role. Um, and I wrote this post kind of like after the past year or so since events opened back up, going to them and being like, yeah, things don't look really good. And I talked to the organizers at almost every event I'd go to and just kind of validate some of what I was seeing. And you know I mean, I've talked to a number of organizers and just kind of seeing also other events that just called it quits. There's been a few big events that called it quits in this year already, and so I'm worried about developer conferences. I think I don't know. I think that the reinvents and the builds are gonna survive. Oh yeah, I'll share that link. So uh, yeah,
I
I'll
already
share
dropped
that
it in for you.
link. Oh, you did? Okay, okay.
Gotcha.
Sorry. So, yeah, I don't know that you know, outside of the reinvents and all this stuff, like how many of these community run events that we've kind of been used to are necessarily going to survive 2023. So I don't know. I mean, do you?
Ooh.
What's your feeling on events?
I have a ghost pepper take. I think we discussed earlier. Pickled ghost pepper take from earlier in the chat. Pickled jalapeno
Yeah,
take. Pickled ghost pepper.
yeah.
Maybe some of them shouldn't survive. And I don't mean that in a I wish that these events should die off sort of phase. I mean, were these events ever inclusive to the audiences that they should be inclusive to in the first place? Were these events
I know quite a few of them, and I think they were inclusive. So I don't know that was the issue.
like
It's just like the events across the board in any conference, regardless, like almost any conference, regardless of how great or not great they are down like 40% from pre-COVID time. So
but like
that's
is it this? Are
pretty
we getting
huge.
new people there? Are we getting? I attended API Days New York last year, and it was like there was a few great talks, but the attendance was really, 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 really far down. And like even this year, like we're looking at our event schedule, and it was very hard to justify. As a DevRel, part of my job is to justify the cost to spend on a conference. And part of it is like, okay, if we're not speaking or we're not, what is worth us going? And like what conferences
Yeah.
are worth us, which is a hard question to answer. Which then it's like and it sounds terrible to say that because then you're like, okay, if we're not speaking, is that a very selfish way to look at a conference?
Yeah. Suze has an interesting point, which is she says that if they were in person only, they weren't inclusive. And I would say, I wrote about that part too, because it's easy to like, I think there's some truth to that, but it's also, I'd say it's tough because doing hybrid events is actually really not just difficult, it's expensive. And so like that cost, it only adds to the cost, and often really doesn't bring in enough revenue to justify doing both. From a like it's much easier for like say Amazon and AWS reinvent to broadcast their stuff or like build. I mean, they've got these are money losing events to begin with, but your community event, the AV equipment to do that is expensive. The internet to do that is often expensive. I'm gonna close this window. This is bright. So like, and not necessarily reliable. So like, it's not so it's I hear you, Suze, but I'd say it's not so simple from an organizer standpoint to say, hey, we're just going to go hybrid. it's actually a very difficult and expensive thing to do, and doesn't like it adds a lot of cost, and oftentimes that cost isn't made up in the ticket sales that you'd have by adding a virtual version of the event.
One thing I think is interesting to think about, and I think because we can all admit, like, it's a downturn. We've seen our peers suffer layoffs, whether they're fair or not, or I think we're all kind of feeling it. Insert current crisis of everything going on, points to universe and cries a little bit. But I wonder if it's a shift from the conference, because you're right, I don't really see like an AWS canceling, an Reignite or so on and so much. But like, I do see potentially a rise of a smaller meetup, or the smaller groups, potentially like a more grassroots venture. And like, personally, I like those more a little bit, maybe because I'm an awkward human and that's more my speed, but like I can be my own little awkward self again. Or like, we're going to have a little bit more creative approaches. To your point on hybrid events, I actually have experienced one good hybrid event, and the person who has ran it has actually been the most unique person that I would never have thought would have ran it. And it's come from the world of academia. So during like the last semesters, NYU actually has a policy where all of your events and all of your classes have to be available hybrid because of COVID. And so if anybody has been exposed to COVID or is feeling sick, they have to stay home. You're not allowed into the buildings, despite class being offered in person. And we have these like owl things in the middle of the classroom, and everybody pulls up class on their Zoom. And so everybody has Zoom up on their laptops, and you bring laptops in. And again, like, I recognize like the privilege, like this is a graduate student environment where it's 30, 40, sometimes 50 people, but it actually allows, in using tools like Notion and Figma and having 360 cameras, allow it for a unique take on the hybrid space. So I'm curious to see, or like, I spoke at MozFest and I volunteered at MozFest, which is ran by Mozilla, and they've done some really cool things remotely. So I don't know. I want to see more creative approaches here. It'll be interesting.
I agree. I think that's kind of that's where I left it. Like, I don't have any answers to saving it. I think we're in a phase where like we just need to see some experimentation, and just somebody's gonna kind of figure out what the future of in-person and virtual events look like. I think I lean towards the future of in-person events as going to be more, because I've noticed the people who go to them in person now really want that connection with people, and so I think it's we focused so much before on content, and I think the content's always going to be important, but I think maybe putting as much focus on that kind of connection and piece of it is going to be the way we kind of fix those, because and also maybe to shrink the events a little bit. Part of it is there's a bit of a COVID hangover as well, which is hurting a lot of these events, which is that they had contracts that you signed with to save money. You sign with a hotel and you sign this multi-year contract, and now you postponed it a year or two for couple of years for COVID, and now you're back and you're paying this. You're on the same contract you were pre-COVID, but you're down 40% in attendees. The hotel's not that understanding anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So it's complicated, but I do think we're going to see some innovation here, and hopefully not just good events disappearing. So on that note, on that note, we are going to move on to the final thing, which is super important, which is
the most questionably most important thing of this entire event.
Okay. Unquestionably.
Who likes
which is
pickle
facts?
So I think we should kick us off with a little bit of literacy, since we're both some liberal arts folks here in the world of DevRel, to keep it on our ish trend. So fun fact, today, if you were to say that you're in a pickle, it's kind of a way to say that you're in a troublesome situation, like the state of developer events. They're a little bit in a pickle, or you've gotten us in a pretty pickle here with developer events. But 400 years ago, modern English actually borrowed that from the Dutch, which they expressed predicament with the phrase "in de pickle zitten." Probably butchered that. So for Dutch, I'm so sorry.
I'm sure it was 100% correct. That's the way.
That was 100% correct. Like, take me back 400 years. No one's time has a time machine. If you do, hit me up. That'd be pretty dope. Let's go explore some things. Which literally translates to sit in a salty solution used to preserve meats and vegetables. This was found in Shakespeare's Tempest, which when Alonso asked Trinculo, "How camest thou in this pickle?" in Lord Byron's Don Juan, "The Turkish batteries thrashed them in a fail, or like a good boxer into a sad pickle." And first off, there's got to be a DevRelish Hot Ones crossover. Let's make that happen. I do agree. Episode 1, and we're setting our sights high for this season.
Yeah, I think, I love it. I think this is why I was so glad that you agreed to host this show with me, because you were willing to like lean into the relish aspect of DevRelish.
I mean, I have pitched and submitted a CFP multiple times to a couple of conferences about how developer relations is like fermentation. And no one, so weird fact about me, I don't know if you knew this, Brian, when we agreed on the pickle theme. Instead of making bread during the pandemic, I actually did get into fermentation. I make kimchi, and there's actually homemade pickles in my fridge right this instant.
I did not know this. So it all just came
together. But I do ferment things, and I have submitted a CFP that has been rejected twice. So if you need someone, there's an entire CFP and prep already ready to go. So someone invite me to your conference so I can talk about fermentation and DevRel. Or
I'm not obsessed with pickles or relish. I do love a good hot dog, but I like that with sauerkraut, which is, I guess, pickled something, but pickled cabbage. But yeah, so, but apparently I have an obsession with food themed things. Like I was, Certified Fresh Events started out like the logo was off of like a fruit, like you see like little stickers on fruit. We are first, I had the first podcast we started on the site was Code Sandwich Hour, and I have another site, another project I've been working on which was the whole enchilada. So, it's like, apparently I like food themed things for developers. So that's, I didn't even know. Somebody pointed it out to me, actually, Sean, who hosts the other show. He's like, you kind of love these food themed things. I'm like, I guess I do.
Yeah.
So anyway, with that, we will wrap it up. Yeah. So I really appreciate everybody. Yeah, it's been so exciting to see like all these comments, and just for our first show. I'm excited about our first guest. So just kind of keep your eyes on cfe.dev for who that's going to be. We'll be announcing that soon. So, and hopefully you'll all join us again. So thank you. Thanks, Erin. This was a lot of fun. I can't wait to keep this going. And we'll see you all again next time.
Yeah, we'll put a lid on it, I guess. I'm going to steal that from Nick. Thank you very much. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, feedback, want to shamelessly promote your blog post, drop it in the cfe.dev Discord. I dropped the link above, but you can also find it right here. I'm going to copy it in the chat right here, and just find me on the interwebs, and we'll keep it going.
Bye.
Bye.